change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind if it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
In this next part, this next line, there's a couple of different thoughts about what this passage means, where Jesus says, I say to you, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. And some believe what Jesus is saying here, that it's before he returns to them on this actual crusade, on this actual mission, that they won't be able to get through all of Israel. But some believe that they didn't get through all the cities of Israel because of the exile that happened in 70 AD. But then there's others who believe that Jesus is talking about that they won't get to all the cities of the world where the Jews had fled to before Jesus' second coming. And then when Jesus says that a disciple is not above his teacher or a servant above his master, all he's doing here is he's just simply saying, we shouldn't be expecting to be treated any better than Jesus was treated. And here where it says, like his teacher and like his master, the words mean exactly like his teacher, exactly like his master. So that's what Jesus has in store for us. He's pretty humble and he exalts us to a pretty great position with him. And then with Jesus's persecutors calling Jesus Beelzebub, well, that's just his persecutors calling him another derogatory name that was used for Satan. And it literally means the Lord of the flies or the Lord of dung. And so Jesus, he tells his disciples not to fear them, and that these persecutions, they shouldn't stop us from speaking about Jesus' kingdom. That none of this, nothing that they do will be hidden. Then we hear from him about these truths that he reveals to us on our bed at night or in our private, quiet time, that we're not to keep them secret, but we're supposed to proclaim the things Jesus speaks to us publicly, no matter what the danger is or no matter the kind of persecution, because we're not to keep God's message just to ourselves, just to our own fellowship. It's not just for the holy few, because there's only one message, which is for the salvation of all people. And it's very important because the whole world is to hear about God's salvation. And that's even if they can't understand it. But we're not to hide Jesus' message from them. Jesus went to great lengths to bring us his message. So we're required to do the same thing. And when Jesus says here, there's nothing covered that won't be revealed, basically he's really saying, nobody is really going to get away with anything. It's all going to come out. And then we're told to fear God, that this creator of our body and soul, who can destroy both of them in hell, that we need to fear him more than those who can just kill our bodies. And if you really think about it, it's really hard to do because we get intimidated just by those who want to try to kill our reputations, let alone people who try to kill our bodies. If you notice, it's really hard to be rejected just for, your political party that you're planning to vote for, and let alone people killing us. But right here, Jesus, he talks about hell, and that's true because hell's real. And even though there's a lot of people now who don't believe in hell today, there's a lot of people even in the church now not really thinking of the hell that's described in the Bible. But Jesus, he mentions hell 27 times in the gospel, and it's way more than he ever mentions heaven. And the thing here is that our souls, they are so much more valuable than our bodies because our souls, well, they are the real us. Our bodies are just the dirt containers that house our souls. But the next line tells us that God, He is also very aware of our bodies too. And that things, they're never out of his control. He's so aware that he's even aware of sparrows falling to the ground. And he says he's very much more aware of the details of even how many hairs you have on your head. And there's about 140,000 hairs on a person's head. And it doesn't just say that they're counted. He's saying here that they're all numbered. So they each have their own number, and God knows how many you have and which numbers are left. And so that tells us that he keeps a very current count. So we're very current in his thoughts because those numbers are constantly changing. And where someone may feel that God has forgotten about them, the truth is that he couldn't. And he's very aware of every detail in every circumstance that surrounds us. And so he tells us that those who can kill the body, they actually can't harm us. And if you fear God, you don't have to ever fear any man. So we're not to fear because we are told God loves sparrows, but he loves us more. And so 3 times here, Jesus has told us not to fear. And the reason that he says it 3 times here is because we tend to fear and we tend not to trust God. So our instruction here is to stop fearing and that we need to start having faith that God's taking care of us. And then Jesus, he starts this whole next section with a therefore, which therefore means we take everything that Jesus has said up to now, everything he said up to this point. So we take everything about the message of the kingdom and about all the persecutions, about enduring to the end. We take all of how it's good enough to be like your teacher and about speaking in the light, what you hear in the darkness, and fearing God and not man. Because of all this that he said, he makes us this promise. And he says that if we will confess him before men, Jesus will confess us before his Father, which is a great deal. And confessing doesn't just mean going and saying his name, but it's more about confessing of our relationship, of being one with him in our relationship with him. And so when we tell the world about Jesus, how we know him and how we're one with him, now he's going to say to his Father, he's going to say, this one is mine. He belongs to us. But Jesus, he's really honest with these disciples about all the hardships that are going to come with confessing him, all the mockings that come and all the persecutions. But isn't this really worth it for Jesus to go around bragging about us to his Father? And then he says, if you're not willing to confess him, that he won't confess us either. In fact, he tells us that he'll actually end up speaking against us to his Father. So this tells us you can't be a secret Christian, that this is really a war, and that you actually have to choose a side. And then Jesus goes on and he tells us about peace on earth. And it doesn't matter what our Christmas cards say. It says here he's not bringing peace on earth, but he's bringing a sword. He says, do not think I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. So this is kind of hard to fit into our Christmas story, thinking of this little baby with a sword. But a sword means that Jesus has come to bring division, because that's what a sword represents. It represents dividing things. And this division is going to come all the way down to our very own families. And I hope it's not the way it is in your family, but it is this way in parts of my family. And we see this kind of division in our communities. We see this kind of division in our schools. We see it in our state. We see it in our country. Where one stands with Jesus, it divides you from the whole world. And there are to be no neutral parties. So you have to pick a side. And he tells us clearly that we have to love Jesus more than anyone. And here he's saying, you can't choose your children over him, and you can't choose your parents over him, or your siblings. And he tells us that our very enemies are going to be the people in our own households. But if you notice here, Jesus doesn't say you have to choose him over your wife. And he doesn't say you have to choose Jesus over your husband. And I believe that's because in a marriage relationship, we're considered one flesh with him. That our marriages are actually bound in vows to God. But to be worthy of Jesus, you have to choose him above all others. And then he goes on and he says, you actually have to choose him above your very own life. Because the very next thing he says is, who does not take up his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. And so you can see why it's difficult to receive Jesus' words. And you can see why so many people don't choose to follow after him. You can see why this message wasn't really popular and that it still isn't very popular. And in the first century, everybody knew what Jesus was talking about. Where today we might go and we might say, well, you know, my job is my cross to bear. Or, oh, my cross is my children's problem. Or it's my mother-in-law. Or it's my daughter-in-law. Or anything that seems to be our troubles in this life. But in first century Rome, they saw this carried out every day, where people would be carrying their crosses and they would carry them to a place where they would actually be put on that cross and they would die a horrifying death that came after days of suffering. And that's exactly what the cross meant. The cross meant your death. And the only hope you can have when you're carrying a cross was a life in the resurrection or an afterlife. And you have to realize that when Jesus said all of this to his disciples, talking about being crucified, they haven't talked about Jesus being crucified yet. It wasn't even a thought by these disciples at this time. But now Jesus is saying, if you're not willing to do this, well, you're not worthy of me. And this isn't symbolic, and it's not a parable. It's not anything else. He's saying, if you're not willing to die for Jesus, you're not worthy of him. But if you want to have your life your way, well, that's your choice. But it's Jesus who's telling you that you're going to lose your life. And Jesus, he knows, because Jesus is life. But if you're willing to do this other thing, if you're willing to take up this cross and to lose your life for his sake, he gives you another promise, and he says, you're going to find it. So we find our life when we give our life to Jesus to follow him. And now I don't believe that Jesus is saying here that this is the requirement to be saved, that you have to be willing to die for Jesus to go to heaven. I don't think he ever said that. But he is saying that you have to surrender your life to him, and that you have to believe that he is who he says he is, that he died on a cross for you. And none of us here, we're never really ever worthy of him anyways, even if we did die on a cross. But I do believe if you do know him, and as you get to know him and his faithfulness, and you get to know his love towards you, that you find out that he's actually crazy in love with you. And then when you realize that he not only would do anything for you, but he already did do everything for you. And as you get to know this about Jesus, and he reveals himself to you, it becomes clearer, and it becomes much easier to be able and willing to take up that cross and to follow him. And you know that all of these disciples here, they did this, except for Judas Iscariot, who committed suicide because he was really of the devil, and the Apostle John, which was the only one of these to ever die a natural death, who lived up into his 90s. But the rest of these, they all died a martyr's death. They were all killed for their faith in Jesus as they followed him daily. But the truth is, none of them really lost their lives. All these disciples, they gave their lives. And all of these disciples, They found their lives just like Jesus said they would. And I don't think they would have ever had it any other way. So I believe salvation is free. It doesn't cost you anything. But to be a disciple, there's a cost to it. And that cost is taking up your cross and following Jesus. And most people have a hard time making this kind of a commitment. And most of Jesus' disciples, well, the truth is, most of them, they don't die a martyr's death. But the whole idea here is that you need to be willing to. But then Jesus, he goes on and he starts to tell us that no one will lose their reward for anything they do for Jesus. And so it says, when someone receives us, or when they receive one of these apostles or any servant of Christ, that they're actually receiving Jesus. And when they actually receive us, and they're receiving Jesus, they're actually receiving God the Father, because we represent Jesus, and Jesus, he represents the Father. And this is more about that being one with them. And it says that anyone who is a servant of Christ, and he is received as a servant of Christ, he'll be receiving Jesus. And the reason is they're receiving Jesus is because we're not really bringing our message. We're actually bringing his message. We're bringing them Jesus' message. And the truth is that they actually live in us, that Jesus lives in us by the power of the Holy Spirit, and the Father lives in Jesus by the same power of the Holy Spirit. And then Jesus gives us 3 examples of how people can receive us, or how we are to receive other believers. It says, if they receive us as a prophet, and what a prophet is just somebody who speaks for God. So these are people who speak God's words, which means these people are speaking the words of the Bible. And so if they receive us or others, or we receive them who are speaking God's words as a prophet, and that's the way they receive us, well, they're going to get the same reward as the prophet gets. And if you receive someone that's a representative as a righteous man, and I think that's what we would probably call, if someone receives you as a good Christian, then they're going to receive that kind of reward. And it goes all the way down to just receiving somebody and giving somebody a cup of water. And when Jesus, he talks about these little ones, he's not talking about children. He's talking about these disciples, that we are his little ones. He's talking about us. But the thing is that everything that's done for Jesus or for his disciples, it will be rewarded, all the way down to giving that little cup of water. And then there's some of us here who may find themselves willing to die for Jesus, but they're having a hard time trying to live for Jesus in a daily way, where you're giving up your daily life to the dreary things of life, to the daily things, when life isn't exciting and it's not glamorous, and you're just serving day in and day out. It would be like taking care of people and ministering to the people that Jesus has given you to take care of, like maybe children or handicapped or maybe aging parents, and that you're sacrificing your life for others to live more humanely, I believe, is part of taking up this cross, because I don't think taking up the cross necessarily means that you have to die on that cross. It's only if Jesus calls you to do that. But really, I think what it all comes down to is that we are to give our lives to Jesus daily. And we are to follow him daily, no matter what he calls us to. So after Jesus sent out his 12 disciples, he goes out just like they did to preach in the cities and villages. And sometimes you'll hear people say that what he was doing is he was going to the same cities and villages where he had already sent his disciples out to. And in these days, this would have been the most efficient way to spread the message of the kingdom of heaven, because there was no mass media, there were no newspapers, so everything was done by word of mouth. And here Jesus is at the height of his popularity. And John the Baptist, he's been in prison about 10 months now, and he's been hearing about all these things that Jesus is doing. And John, he's not in prison for doing anything wrong. He hasn't committed any crime. John's in prison for standing in the truth regarding Herod Antipas's adultery. And this wasn't just like some type of one-time act of passion or indiscretion by Herod. This was a long, incestuous act of adultery, and it was being committed by the one who wanted to be known as the king of Israel, like his father had been known. But Herod Antipas, he wasn't a king. He was only a tetrarch, and he was a tetrarch of Galilee. And what a tetrarch means is the ruler of a quarter, because he ruled 1/4 of Israel. And that's because when Herod the Great died, who did have the title of being king, and that's the same Herod that he tried to kill baby Jesus, that happened to be Herod Antipas's father. Well, what he did is he divided the kingdom of Israel into 4 parts, and he gave a quarter to each of his sons. But when Herod Antipas, when he went and he visited Rome, he visited his brother, he seduced his brother Philip's wife. And the funny thing is that his wife happened to be both of their niece, and her name just happened to be Herodias, because she also was a granddaughter of Herod the Great. But for Herod Antipas to make this seem like this marriage was legitimate, what he did is he went and he divorced his real wife and he married Herodias. And you would think that the other Jewish leaders, that they should have opposed Herod in this because of this kind of immorality, and that they should have sought for John's freedom, but they didn't do anything. And it's just like it is today, where sometimes you have these leaders that they'll tolerate a lot of evil just as long as the people that are being persecuted, well, it actually fits their own causes. Because John being in prison, it did fit the Jewish leaders' causes. Because the Jewish leaders will read that they envied John because the people considered John to be a prophet, though they would never ever confirm him to be a prophet. And it would seem that John the Baptist, that he would have had to have said something, because John is a prophet of God. And this is Israel. This is not like a pagan country like Rome with no morals. This is Israel. This is God's chosen land, and it's inhabited by God's chosen people. And John, he is God's prophet. And the thing is, he knows that now the Messiah is here. And like remember it said, make every path straight. We need to get the way ready for the Messiah. And so now you have this man, and he was a prophet of God, and he lived free, and he lived outdoors in the wilderness. And now he's being confined in a small, dingy, gloomy little room in a dungeon inside of a prison. And this prison, it was located down by the Dead Sea. It was called the Fortress of Machaerus. So now this prophet who once proclaimed the truth is now being silenced by the wicked. And even though John could probably understand why the Pharisees didn't secure his release, he's having trouble with, well, why hasn't Jesus come yet? Where's Jesus? And so John, what he does is he sends 2 of his disciples to Jesus, because even though John has been hearing everything that Jesus is doing, because he does, he knows about everything he's doing. He knows about his healings, and he knows all about all his miracles. John had never imagined that this is how his life would turn out, to be condemned to this misery in prison.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh, oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,